we're beginning our study, a new study. It couldn't, in my opinion, be more timely or exciting. If you looked at current events, I think we all know all that's going on. And we will get much out of this study, Lord willing, and much more if you actively participate. So I'm going to encourage each of us, all of us, to actually participate outside of our class time. Okay? So I'm going to suggest that we do two things. You see that? I'm going to suggest that we read it, that is Daniel, daily, and take notes. I'm going to suggest that you take notes today at your table, and also throughout the week as you read Daniel. And this is why learning theory tells us that lecture is the worst form of education. Isn't that great? Is that right, Claire? It is absolutely the worst because we retain like under 10% of what we hear, solely hear. When we listen and read, hence PowerPoint, it jumps up amazingly. But if you listen and read and write, so you have auditory, visual, and kinesthetic, your comprehension and your retention just go through the roof. So you could read the whole book. It's 12 chapters. It's not that bad. Or you might read one chapter a day and then, go recycle. Or the passage that we're going to study that week. But I'm going to really encourage us to read Daniel, and you'll get to know it. And the other thing I'm going to suggest is have a little notebook. And you can take notes, ask questions of yourself, whatever, when you're reading it on your own. Who can tell me how many books there are in the Old Testament? You do know the Old Testament is divided up into books. This is an Awana quiz. Yes, 39. That's right. And here they are. We have 39. Can you see them? It's a little dark, but you have these up here that are kind of in turquoise, and then the other set here, which if this were bright enough, you would know that they were kind of orange. Can anyone tell me what these first 5 are called? Pentateuch. Very, very good. And the next ones, we've got Judges and Ruth and Samuel and Kings, Chronicles. What is that section? Whoever said that is 100,000 points right there. That's both of your tables. That's the history section, followed by these, which you can't really see the color, but it's reddish. And we've got Job, Psalm, Proverbs, etc. What is that section? Poetry or wisdom? Yes, yes. Followed, everything after Song of Solomon is then a prophet. And the one up there in big, bold, and white are the major prophets, and the smaller ones in yellow are the minor prophets. And there they are. We have the Pentateuch, the history section, the wisdom or the poetry section, major prophets and minor prophets. Understanding this, we'll see where Daniel falls, and that helps us get a contextual understanding of the book as a whole. Okay? Now, I do have a question. This is worth 1,000,000 points. 1,000,000. Are the major prophets more significant than the minor prophets? All right, it's 5 points. Why? Why are they not? And if not, why are they called major if the other guys are minor? Very good. I don't know what anybody else said because we're all masked, but I heard. Now, the majors are bigger. They have grander scope. There's bigger books. There's more words. And they're dealing usually with bigger scope, whereas the minor ones are smaller. So you're going to have something like Isaiah being a much bigger book than Joel. Right? Who are the major prophets? This is 0 points because they're up there. Yes, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Daniel, and Lamma. Jeremiah wrote Lamentation. And then we have all the minor prophets. And Daniel then comes at the end. He is the last of the major prophets, followed by. So studying the book of Daniel is an adventure, I think. I think it is a tremendous adventure. And I think, as I was thinking about it, the Old Testament, well, Daniel is to the Old Testament what Revelation is to the New Testament. And it's just amazing that what we get to see as we're studying the book. And there is a term that is used for what it is that we get to see, because we get to kind of push back the veil a little bit, and we see what we call the latter days. Okay, so we will be studying that, and it's a time of upheaval, but it's also a time of great faithfulness. And that's really what we want to focus on. Daniel, the book of Daniel, gives us a panoramic view of the history of time, the history of the world. And yet at the same time, it's very, very practical. And it reminds me of something that Peter said in 2 Peter. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, and here comes the kicker, what sort of people should you be? That's the question. What sort of people should we be, given the fact that we're in the latter days? Does this remind you of kind of the tagline or the focus on Thessalonians? What was it that we studied in Thessalonians that was kind of a similar thought? That's right. 10,000 points. And surely you had that too, didn't you? I shared those points. Very good. Yes, Jesus is coming. How then shall we live? Well, it's the same kind of thought. Given that we're in the latter days and all the stuff that we're going to be seeing and here in Peter, and everything's going to be burned up and dissolved in the earth and the works and etc., all this is going to be dissolved. What sort of people should we be? So this is an important question for us to ask as we are starting Daniel, especially with what I think are the key verses. And here they are. You have a Daniel in the 2nd chapter and Daniel in the 4th chapter. Daniel 2:20 and 22 and Daniel 2:44, and then Daniel 4:34. I think those are key verses to understand really the broad scope of Daniel and the focal point. So let's read those. And you can turn to that in your Bibles, but I'll just put it up on here on the screen also. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings. He sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. Do we know who wrote this? Sounds like a good Jewish boy. It was not. There was a bad pagan king who came to his senses at one point. But the focal point is how big God is. Actually, how totally other. And then we look at the 44th verse of chapter 2. And in those days, and in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms, and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. And then finally, in Daniel 4:34 and 35, his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. He does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? He is big. He is different. And in the words of C.S. Lewis, he is not a tame lion. So as we look at Daniel, really what we're seeing is God. You know the little road signs that say, caution, man at work? This should have one that says caution, man at work. Because we see the events of history, even things going on right now, and God is big and nobody can say to him, what have you done? But so then we ask ourselves, in light of all of this, what sort of people should we be? And that really is the question. So we'll begin as we start. I'd like to remember we need to know the historical context of everything. I want to start and get right into the first chapter for just a moment and kind of see what has been happening. So we're in Daniel 1, looking at 1 through 6. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar and to his house, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. We could spend a lot of time on that and the significance of the vessels of the temple going to a pagan deity. But I want to focus in mainly on two things. Two places are mentioned here. What are they? Judah and Babylon, right? And there's two kings mentioned, Jehoiakim, who's king of Judah, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So we're talking Judah and Babylon. And these provide the background for what we are going to see in the book of Daniel. Judah was God's place. Right? Babylon was Satan's place. Judah was the place where Jerusalem was, the city of God and the temple of God. Babylon was the place of what? Remember what was built there? The Tower of Babel. In direct opposition to what God said. I want you to go out and multiply and subdue the earth. And they said, let's get all together and live in a big city and make a tower under the heavens. And it's from there that we have all false religions, and God confused them and gave them different languages. We have the false religion and the true religion against Satan. This has been the cosmic battle in the universe since the fall of Satan. We're going to see how it ends. That's the understanding. That's the exciting thing. But we have to understand here, the king of Judah is no, Luke Skywalker, right? He's not a great hero. He's an evil king, as were most of the kings after David and Solomon did well. So God raises up Babylon to chastise Judah, chastise Israel. And the hammer comes crashing down. We'll do more of the details of this next time. It comes crashing down, and our focal point of where the hammer lands is on Daniel, in our story, and his three friends, and everybody else who got captured and dragged across the desert to Babylon. So then we continue in verse 3. Then the king commanded Aspenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both the royal house and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, competent to stand in the king's place, and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. We could do various things with this, starting with this guy, Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch. Maybe he was, dragged and captured from some city and brought to Babylon, where he was, he had his career defined for him, shall we say. And he became the chief eunuch and the assistant to the king, and he's dealing now with the nobility and the royal family, the young folks that were captured and brought back. I don't know that any Old Testament prophet had any greater impact and significance on the history of Israel than Daniel. So we see here that he was noble born, educated, taken away from his homeland as a teenager, probably around 15 or so. And we can learn actually more about the time of Daniel by reading Ezekiel, because Ezekiel and Daniel were contemporaries, at the same age, in fact. Daniel saw his nation fall. He saw his culture collapse. He saw a prolonged battle against Jerusalem, and he was captured and brought to Babylon as a prisoner. That's a harsh reality. And then we go on. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that the king drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of the time that they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. You've known these, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You've learned those probably in Sunday school when you were taught. But it was not such a nice thing that he's getting this food and these drinks, because they are engaged in a 3-year brainwashing regimen. That's what's going on here. Everything that they had, everything that they knew was crushed and removed from them, even their own names, and they were given names, as I understand it, relating to the deities of Babylon. So they're in this 3-year brainwashing regimen so that they could be assimilated. Resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. They want to become in the Babylonian culture and to become useful to the king, so that everything that they knew and everything that they were familiar with was removed from them. They stayed firm. And we'll learn about their faithfulness and what they did. But right now, I didn't mean to do that. That's the next slide. So let's leave it there. We look at the book as a whole, because this is an introduction. What we have here, generally, when somebody studies this, they often divide it into 2 sections in here. They are the man and the message. Chapters 1 through 6 is often thought of as dealing with the prophet, the man, and 7 through 12 with the prophecies. This is not the structure we're going to use, because I think there's a better one. But most commentators will gravitate toward this. They will at least reference this kind of. It's a very easy, if you go into the book, it's very easy to divide 1 through 6 and 7 through 12. But I think there's, instead of 2 sections, I think there's actually 3. I think there are 3 sections that give us better context than this one. This one normally looks something like this. You have the biographical section, where Daniel interprets dreams, and it's 1 through 6, and you have Nebuchadnezzar and historical stuff going on. And then you have the 7 through 12, where there's the main emphasis of the prophecy of Daniel. And also, when we're studying this, we might go into the Babylonian rule, the rule of the Medo-Persians, the Greek kingdom, the Roman kingdom, and Gentile powers thereafter. There are kings mentioned: Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, Cyrus, Alexander the Great, 4 unnamed generals. We will get to those, but I don't think that is part of the structure like this. What I think we are going to have is a structure more like this in 3 parts. And the reason I think this is because of the languages that Daniel is written in. It is not written in 1 language. It is actually written in 2. There's a Hebrew section, and an Aramaic section, and then another Hebrew section. So I don't think this is an accident. He just didn't say, oh, I'm tired of talking Hebrew. I think I'll go to Aramaic. I think God, in his revelation of this, had a point in who he's addressing and who is the audience, who is the focal point. So when it's Hebrew, what's the focal point? Who's the audience? The Jews, absolutely. When it's Aramaic, it's the Gentiles. And I think that's an important key in understanding the details of what's going on. So we not only have a context, a historical context, I think we also have a linguistic context that we need to understand as we are going into the book. So I think God actually structured this in his inspired word, specifically to help us understand and specifically for some of the people that was involved. So the first chapter is introducing what's going on, and that's the Jews. Then we have chapters 2 through 7, and actually the very first verse or two of chapter 2 is in Hebrew, and it very decidedly switches to Aramaic, and then the last chapters 8 through 12. So you'll know when you're reading where you're at. If you're reading in the 8 and beyond, you're back to Hebrew. If it's in the middle of the section of 2 through 7, the focal point is the Gentiles, and then Hebrew in chapter 1. And that will help understand what's going on. So we have the languages that tell us an intended audience for the particular chapter that we're reading. And this will help us better understand what's going on. So I'm hopeful that I can do this now. And John, you can run up here if I'm messing up. But I have a movie.
The story set right after Babylon's first attack on Jerusalem, and they had plundered the city and its temple and taken a wave of Israelites into exile. Among them were 4 men from the royal family of David: Daniel, who's later named Belteshazzar, and his 3 friends who you probably know by their Babylonian names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This book tells of their struggles to maintain hope in the land of their conquerors. The book's design seems pretty simple at first. Chapters 1 through 6 contain stories about Daniel and his friends in Babylon, while chapters 7 through 12 contain the visions of Daniel about the future. But this 2-part shape is made even more interesting by another design feature, and that's the book's language. It begins in Hebrew, the language of the Israelites, but chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, a cousin language to Hebrew spoken widely among the ancient empires. But then in chapters 8 through 12 it goes back to Hebrew. This design shows how chapters 2 through 7 are a coherent section, but it also highlights the importance of chapters 2 and 7 for understanding the later chapters of the book. Let's just dive in. Chapter 1 introduces the basic tension of the first half of the book. Daniel and his friends, they're really wise and capable, and they're recruited to serve in the royal palace of Babylon. But they're pressured to give up their Jewish identity by living and eating like Babylonians and violating the Jewish food laws found in the Torah. So they refuse, and they choose faithfulness to the Torah, and it puts them in danger. But God delivers them, and they end up being elevated by the king of Babylon. After this begins the Aramaic section, which you'll see has this really cool symmetrical design. So first, the king of Babylon has a dream that, it turns out, only Daniel is able to interpret. It's about a huge statue made of 4 types of metal, and it symbolizes a sequence of kingdoms, and the head is Babylon. But then a huge rock comes flying in, and it shatters the statue, and it becomes this huge mountain. Now, this dream is the first of many symbolic visions in the book, and this one introduces the basic storyline of them all. Daniel says that the statue represents a train of human kingdoms following from Babylon, and they will all fill God's world with violence. But one day, God's kingdom will come and will confront and humble the arrogant kingdoms of this world and fill the world with the healing justice of God's reign and rule. After this, chapter 3 tells the famous story of Daniel's 3 friends who refuse to bow down and worship a huge idol statue, which, like the statue in chapter 2, represents the king and his imperial power. And so the friends are persecuted. They're thrown into a fiery furnace, but God delivers them from death, and they're exalted by the king, who now acknowledges their God as the true one. After this come a pair of stories about 2 Babylonian kings, the father, Nebuchadnezzar, and then his son, Belshazzar. They're both filled with pride because of their imperial power. And so, like in chapter 2, God warns them both through dreams and then visions, which, also like chapter 2, only Daniel can interpret. He says that both kings are to humble themselves before God, and both kings arrogantly resist. So Nebuchadnezzar is stricken with madness. He becomes like a beast in the field. But then he humbles himself before God, and his humanity returns to him. He's restored as king. This is in contrast with his son, Belshazzar, who doesn't humble himself before God, and he's assassinated that very night. Now, these two stories draw this imagery from Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and Psalm 8, where humans are depicted as the royal image of God. He's given them authority to rule over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air on behalf of God, who is the world's true king. But when human kingdoms forget that, when they rebel and make themselves and their power into a God, they become less than human, like violent beasts who will face God's justice. Which brings us to chapter 6, the pair of chapter 3. And this time it's Daniel who's being persecuted because he refuses to pray and worship the king as a god. And so like the friends, he's sentenced to death and he's thrown into a lion's den. But God delivers him from the beasts, and like the friends, the king exalts Daniel and praises his God, which brings us to chapter 7. It's the pair of chapter 2 and the center of the book where all its themes come together. It's another dream, but it's Daniel's this time. And ironically, he can't understand the dream until an angelic messenger explains it to him. He sees a series of 4 beasts, one like a lion, then like a bear, then one like a winged leopard, each of these symbolizing an arrogant kingdom. And last of all is a super beast, identified as a really evil empire, and it has lots of horns, a common symbol for kings in the Old Testament, and there's one specific horn who is an image of an arrogant king who exalts himself above God and persecutes God's people. Now they are symbolized by a figure called the Son of Man, who's an image for both God's covenant people, but also for their king from the line of David. But then all of a sudden, God, who's called the Ancient of Days, comes and he sets up his throne. He destroys the super beast and he exalts the Son of Man on the clouds, where he comes up to sit at God's right hand and share in God's rule over the nations. We can look back now and see how all of these stories in the first half fit together. The 3 stories of faithfulness despite persecution, these are meant to offer hope to God's suffering people among the nations. But they suffer because human kingdoms have rebelled against God and have become beasts. And so these visions encourage patience, that God's people are to wait for him to bring his kingdom and rule over our world and vindicate his suffering people. But it raises the question about when God is going to do that, and that's what these final 3 visions set out to explore. In chapter 8, Daniel has another vision about the final 2 beasts of chapter 7, but this time they're symbolized by a ram, who we're told is the image of the empire of the Medes and Persians, and then by a goat, who's an image of ancient Greece. And out of the goat come a whole bunch of horns, one of which symbolizes the evil king from chapter 7. And we're told more about him, that he will attack Jerusalem and exalt himself above God and defile the temple with idols. However, in the end, he will be destroyed by God, who will exalt his people and his kingdom. Now, by chapter 9, Daniel is very puzzled, especially as to when all of this is going to take place. And so he consults the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah, where God said that Israel's exile would only last 70 years. So for Daniel, the 70 years is almost up. And so he asks God to fulfill his promise soon. But an angel comes and informs him that Israel's sin and rebellion has continued. And so their time of exile and oppression will continue on 7 times longer than Jeremiah envisioned. Daniel is deeply disturbed by this, and he has one final vision. We're shown the same sequence of kingdoms. It's Persia, then Greece, and Alexander the Great, followed by lesser kings, all leading up to this final king of the north, who will invade Jerusalem, set up idols in the temple, and exalt himself above God. But then, all of a sudden, this king comes to ruin. Now, there's been endless debate about what all of these visions refer to. Many see a clear connection to the exploits of the Syrian king Antiochus in the 160s BC. He killed many faithful Jews in Jerusalem and set up idols in the temple. Others think it points forward to the Roman Empire's role in the execution of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. And still others think it will be fulfilled in future events that have yet to happen when Jesus will return. Now the problem is that the symbols and the numbers, they don't quite match any of these views perfectly. But it opens up the possibility that, in a sense, they are all right. The book of Daniel has been designed to offer hope to all future generations of God's people. It did so in the days of Antiochus' empire, and it has ever since. This is why Jesus could use imagery from Daniel to describe and confront the oppressive leaders he confronted in Jerusalem. This is why John, the visionary who wrote the Revelation, could adapt Daniel's visions and apply them to Rome of his day and also all future oppressive empires. And so the point of Daniel is that all generations of readers can find here a pattern and a promise. It's a pattern that human beings and their kingdoms become violent beasts when they glorify their own power, when they redefine right and wrong, and don't acknowledge God as their true king. But Daniel also holds out a promise that one day God will confront the beast. He will rescue his world and his people by bringing his kingdom over all nations. And so for every generation, this book speaks a message of hope that should motivate faithfulness. And that's what the book of Daniel is all about.
This, if we were to just look at it fresh, it would be pretty daunting to understand, especially if we're as far away as you guys are. But we're going to have time to go over each of the little squares and even the images inside the squares to help us retain. Because that's the whole point of it, is there's just tons and tons of information with regard to Daniel. And we want to use all the resources we can to learn from it and actually to prosper and ask ourselves, what kind of people should we be in light of all of this? Okay, so lastly, I want to make mention that Daniel wrote absolutely nothing about the church. He didn't even have the church as a concept. People do a lot of hermeneutical gymnastics to get the church into Daniel. He wrote to Jews, and he wrote that in Hebrew, and he wrote to Gentiles, and he wrote that in Aramaic. But the people of the church, us, don't really show up. So if you're reading, and I hope you read lots of stuff on your own, but if you are reading on your own, realize what it is, whatever the perspective is that the person that's reading. And if they're trying to shoehorn the church into it, just put that aside and go and read something else. With the exception of 3 passages, there are 3 passages that do point to the Messiah, but they are veiled. But I want to point those out to us as we close. And I'm going to make mention of the Indian Christmas for India, and also take a cocktail lunch, and then we'll have our table time. So here we have Jesus in the book of Daniel. But it wouldn't have been as clear to Daniel as it is to us. But he's interpreting visions. So he interpreted what he saw, or what somebody else saw. Daniel 2. Now let's look at these chapters for a minute. We have Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, and 9. So based on what we've already seen on the languages, we can know something about whose perspective we have. In chapter 2, what language is it written in? Aramaic. And so this is from a Gentile vision, Gentile perspective, right? And it was a vision of it says, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay. And we'll learn about the image, and we'll learn about the different sections of it and all that. But this stone that comes out of heaven, cut without hands, is a reference to Messiah, the return of Christ, actually. Daniel wouldn't have known what we know. The second one, Daniel 7, where is that? Who is that written to? Or what language is that written in? Aramaic, also. With the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And again, a messianic return of Christ's image. And then 9, and we read, the coming of an anointed one. That should be clear to us. An anointed one shall be cut off. But Daniel would not have known what kind of cutting off, but we can. And certainly that's referring to the crucifixion. So we have these three verses that have veiled imagery, veiled references to Christ, but nothing else in the book of Daniel really references us, except for when it's talking about the times that are coming. There is the time of, in what we call the time of grace, or the latter days, which we are currently living in. But Daniel wouldn't have been thinking about us in Santa Cruz Grace Baptist.